A modern kitchen today is a technological marvel compared to the standard kitchen of the 18th century. It's amazing what we have and we don't realize it until we start to look at an 18th century kitchen and understand how few implements they have. The only heating device, basically an open fire. Just a few pots and pans, even in fairly high-end kitchens. They had very few pieces of equipment if we look at something like inventories at the time period. So the cook in the 18th century had to know how to cook without all that equipment, sometimes with no equipment at all. Soldiers in the field with nothing but a single pot and one little fire to cook with. Or cooks in primitive kitchens with just a few pots and pans. Even in high-end kitchens where you're making 5 or 6 of something and you don't have all the different kinds of vessels that you might need. So what are you going to do? Well, they had answers for some of those things in the 18th century. You might cook by the fire with no implements whatsoever, setting, say, an apple down by the fire and roasting it. You don't need anything. Nothing, just set it by the fire and rotate it. Or maybe you're cooking a whole turkey with nothing but a string. Tie that around the bird and you hang it from something and you can cook an entire bird that way. Some things in the 18th century are cooked right on the coals, nothing else. So you can just have a nice little bed of coals and set the item you want to cook on it, maybe a piece of meat, maybe a piece of bread. Cook it right on the coals. Some things might get cooked under the ashes in a very slow method of cooking. There's so many different ways that you could use basically nothing and still get the job done. Cooking on a stick, whatever it takes. In this circumstance, we're going to be making our own cooking vessel out of food. We're going to take flour and butter and some water and make a dish that not only we can cook in, but that we can serve it in at the same time. There are many times we use flour and water as a paste to do cooking with. So even a standard pie that we think of today, we have a pie dish and we put paste in the bottom of it and then a crust on top. That crust on top is acting like a lid. It's holding in all the steam vapor and all that good stuff. We don't really think about it. We think the pie lid is there because it tastes good. But the reality is it's helping to cook on the inside. And in the 18th century, there are times we want to seal something up even tighter. So we'll take a lid and we will put pie crust around it, or just plain simple dough, just flour and water. And we will use that like a glue so we can tighten the lid down onto it. Or if we don't have a lid, we can use pie crust as an entire lid and set it down on something, if that's what we need to do. So just on a regular metal pot. Making the entire cooking vessel out of flour and water isn't something we generally do today. About as close as we get is something like a turnover, right? We'll make some crust and we'll put something little in there and we'll put that in the oven, and that is basically the entire dish in and of itself. Or a chicken pot pie. It's got a little tin, pie pan, but the rest of that covering is there to help cook it. It's making the entire vessel, but we generally eat that. In the 18th century, those cooking vessels, they were meant to be very, very sturdy and generally probably not eaten. Maybe you would like it, but the whole point of it is that it's tough, that it's strong, that it probably isn't really made to eat. So you could throw that shell out, maybe give it to the animals or something like that, or it might be something that people enjoy. Although I haven't seen any references to people eating these shells that they would make. It is amazing how often, if we're looking for it, we see that they're using something like a raised crust in these cookbooks. There are many different English cookbooks from the time period, and they will give you little hints about how it's going to be cooked. And sometimes we skip over those. We just think it's just going into a dish with a regular pie crust on the top, when in reality, they intended it to be an entire raised crust. So that's what we're going to be making today. We're going to make a raised crust pie. The idea of making your cooking vessel out of paste, which is what we're going to do today, is not necessarily easy. Here we're actually making the cooking pot, as it were, out of paste, out of pie crust. To do that, we need a special kind of pie crust. Now, when we think of pie crust today, we think of the simple pie crust that you get when you get like blueberry pie or something like that, right? The pie crust that goes underneath inside of a pie plate, and maybe it has a cover over it, maybe it doesn't. That pie crust is supposed to be light and fluffy. It's supposed to be easy to break apart. Well, we need just the opposite of that. We need to make a crust that is like concrete. A lot of recipes call for cooking in a coffin, which means just cooking in a box. And what they mean is a cooking in a raised crust here. Some recipes will almost hint at it, that it's supposed to be cooked that way inside of a raised crust, but you kind of have to understand the terminology to see that. And it is so common that the people in the recipe books will just say, oh, cook it in such and such a crust, expecting you to know how to do that. Well, let me tell you, it is not easy. In fact, I struggled over this particular recipe for quite a while trying to get it just right. So I wanted to bring one that was simple, that worked every time. Let's hope this one works this time. This recipe is out of A New and Easy Method of Cookery by Cleland, 1755. Now, the problem with most of these recipes is that, number one, they expect you to already know how to do it, and they just kind of give you some hints. Remember here, as we get to the directions, if you're making regular pie crust, you're making it with butter and with flour and a little bit of water. And you want the butter to be as cold as possible. And that makes a light and fluffy pie crust. If we want the opposite of that, then we do exactly the opposite when we're making our crust. Instead of making it out of cold butter, we're boiling the butter in water. So we're gonna make a hot dough. In fact, sometimes it's called sort of like a hot pie crust or something like that. So here is the directions out of Cleland's cookbook. A paste for any raised pies. And many of these raised pies aren't fruit pies like so many of our pies are today, but they're meat pies. That's what we're gonna be making. Here's her recipe for a paste for any raised pies. To a half a peck of flour, take 2 pounds of butter, boil it in a choppin' of water, make a hole in the flour, pour in the butter and the water. Don't let the sediment at the bottom go in. Skim it clean, then work it up into a paste. Before it is quite cold, raise it up into any shape you please, either small or great pies. If the paste is not wet enough, boil water and put it in. Do the same for any standing paste. And in another place, it talks about the idea of using suet instead of butter, or making it a mix. And that's what we're going to be doing today. So I've kind of brought our measurements down into something a little more doable. We don't need to make a giant pie. So I have a half a peck. So 3.5 pounds of unbleached flour here. You can just use any all-purpose standard flour. We are not necessarily going to eat this. You can eat it if you want to, but that's not really what it's for. I have about a pint of water, and I have a half a pound of butter and a 1/4 pound of suet. I'm gonna put this little pot over the fire, and we're gonna boil that water with our butter and our suet in it. We want it to kind of boil and mix. I will make a dimple in the middle of this flour, and we will pour that in and mix it up until we have a hot dough. This is gonna be kind of hot, so I'm gonna have to use a spoon as I'm mixing it because it's a little too hot for my hands. After a few minutes, it will cool down enough that I can get my hands in there to mix this dough up. And once we get it mixed up nicely, we will let it rest for a half an hour, maybe 15 minutes, and then it'll start to stiffen up a little bit. We don't want to let it get completely cold. We can, but it's much harder to work. As she says here in the recipe, when it's not quite cold, go ahead and form it up into your shape. Now, that sounds easy, but it is not easy. This will slump in the oven, so we have to use different kinds of construction techniques to keep it from just collapsing. One of the reasons why we have this particular mix is to help it to just keep from going limp and falling into itself. The decorations that go on this can be thin. Now, I am going to use one particular decoration, a larger kind of diamond shape here, to put over the seam to help weld it together, because that's the weakest spot in this entire piece. Now that we have our individual pieces, we can start to put it together. We're going to put down our base plate. We're going to lay our wall on here, just on the bottom of the base plate. We're going to use a little glue, and that is a basic egg wash. I'm just going to take one egg and about an equal amount of water, and then mix that up into this little bit of very watery kind of glue, and spread that basically over the entire surface, especially any place where I want two walls to stick to each other or the wall to stick to the base plate. I can put our decorations on it. For the lid, I've got this perfect little ceramic dish here that I can put down onto the baking sheet and then cover that with parchment paper and put the lid on top of it, and then it will form up magically with our little dome shape. If we don't do that, it'll be a flat lid and it won't look nearly as nice. I'm gonna put a few decorations here on the top. To pre-bake this, I would suggest going to 400 degrees and placing it in the oven just long enough for it to harden up a little bit. We don't want it to get very brown or anything like that, because it's going to have to bake for quite a while the second time when it's got the actual food in it. Now that our pie shell is half cooked, we are ready to construct what we're going to put into that pie shell so that we can bake it. Now, this is a recipe that's called a beefsteak pie. And in this beefsteak pie, we're going to put together beefsteaks, and it also has what they call a French pudding, which is really what other recipes would call force meat, and we would just call it meatballs. They're gonna go alongside the steak as an extra component to make it even more fun. Not just meat being cooked in a shell, but something a little extra. This is not a lowly kind of dish here. This is a kind of high end, and the pie shell shows that. Even in circumstances, not in just lowly kitchens, but in really high-end kitchens, you're going to be making these vessels to cook in just like that. This recipe is out of The Whole Duty of a Woman, 1737. A steak pie with a French pudding in it. Season your steaks with pepper and nutmeg and let them stand an hour in a tray. Then take a piece of the leanest of a leg of mutton and mince it small with suet and a few sweet herbs. The tops of young thyme, a branch of pennyroyal, 2 or 3 of red sage, grated bread, yolks of eggs, sweet cream, the raisins of the sun. Work it all together stiff with your hand like a pudding. Roll them round like balls and put them into the steaks in a deep coffin with a piece of sweet butter. Sprinkle a little verjuice on it, bake the pie, cut it up afterwards. Having rolled sage leaves, fry them and stick them upright into the walls, and leave your pie without a lid with the juice of a lemon or an orange. So this is a very fancy pie. We're not going to do it exactly like that, but pretty much like that. The first thing we have to do is basically marinate our steak. We're going to put our nutmeg, our pepper, maybe a little salt on it, and we're going to let them kind of sit in their tray for an hour with those spices. She calls here for the leanest leg of mutton. Now, that's not something we typically have. The best substitute we have is lean ground beef. In their case, they would have to take that lean leg of mutton, cut it up very, very small, and then smash it into a mortar and pestle and kind of turn it into a paste. We take a lean ground beef and we add suet to it. So we're adding a fat to it. We're also going to add our spices, thyme, and sage. We're not going to add pennyroyal. Pennyroyal is something you find in 18th century recipes, but pennyroyal isn't good for you in larger quantities. It calls for grated bread. It calls for the yolks of eggs. When we see yolks of eggs in a recipe like this, we don't know whether or not it's a raw yolk or it's one that's a yolk from a boiled egg. I would say from this context that it's probably meant to be a binder, and so therefore we're going to use a raw yolk of egg. A little bit of cream, again, that's with that egg yolk. That makes me think that they're both liquid. We're going to add a few raisins to that and then mix it all together into our little meatballs. And those will be constructed into this pie. We're going to cut up our pieces of steak here a little bit smaller so it's easy to get at them, probably into gobbet or edible sized pieces of meat, and mix it in with the meatballs Once we have those constructed into our pie, we're gonna put a couple slices of butter up on top, and we're gonna squeeze a lemon on top of that. It calls for verjuice, and you might have access to verjuice. I don't, but one of the great substitutes for verjuice is plain lemon juice. The other thing I want this to seal up fairly well. So what we'll do is make a very little bit of a fresh paste, basically just flour and water. Turn it into a glue, like a paste. And we'll put a little bit of that around the top and then set this lid on, and that will hold this tight. The whole point here is that we're trying to hold in all that moisture so that it is sort of being baked in its own little sealed container, like a Dutch oven. We don't know exactly how long to bake this. It doesn't call for it. She doesn't know how big the pie is you're going to be making, so she doesn't give us directions like that. We're going to bake this one for about an hour at 350 degrees. We'll see what it looks like then. I baked this pie for 90 minutes. I went ahead and let it set in the oven a little bit longer just because I knew it was sealed in there. It can't really overcook unless you really go crazy with it. The crust still looked good, so that means I could just leave it in a little bit longer. And I cut the lid off of it and after I let it cool, and it just looks perfect, right? So this is how it would be served. You cut the lid off, and the directions in the recipe called for adding little sprigs of something to it to dress up this idea. But this would come to the table in its own serving bowl. Not only is it the vessel we cook it in, but it's the vessel we serve it in. People would dip out of this and put the food onto the individual plates. This one isn't huge like they might have been in the 18th century, but you can see that everything is cooked well. And if we dig down underneath, we still have lots of sort of gravy liquid down below here. So it isn't dry at all. It kept all that moisture in here and cooked it perfectly. Let's give this a taste. I've got a little bit of the steak here. Has a great texture and a great flavor to it. That little bit of sort of marinating time makes complete sense here. This is the French pudding, as it were, or the meatball. No, that's great flavor. Very surprising. I'm not even sure where all that wonderful flavor comes from. This recipe turned out so good. It took extra time. Yes, just like in the 18th century, it takes extra time. But can you imagine the look of 5 or 6 of these on the shelf in the pantry or coming to the table? We don't do anything like this. Nothing as spectacular as this today. It's something we should all try, even though it's a little extra difficult, but it's worth the effort, even if we have to try it a couple times, which I did on this recipe, and boy, did it turn out.